Welcome to the module on the concept of sustainability. This is the third part of this particular module. In this part, we will be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of this particular concept. In the previous part, we understood what sustainable development means, how development informs the concept of sustainability. We've understood that ideas like reviving growth, that the idea of growth itself can be challenged, that the ideas of job, food, energy, water, sanitation inform the idea of sustainability. The idea of reorienting technologies and managing risks should be brought into the idea or the concept of environmental management, and all of this informs public policy at both the local and the international level when we're talking of sustainable development. So what are the strengths of this particular concept? The very definition of sustainability in terms of sustainable development is one of its strengths. Why? Think of the concept that I spoke of, the most popular definition of sustainable development. Development not just for now but for future generations as well. It's a broad concept that kind of captures everything. Now what happened was, because this concept was so broad, it brought to one platform people who usually don't agree on a lot of things. For example, the concept of sustainable development was used by politicians, was used by industry, was used by local people, as well as, say, by NGOs, by civil society, by media. This concept, by its very definition, was so broad that it was able to bring together people of different interests, people from different levels of power, to talk about what is so important that in terms of the environment that we have to consider when we're talking of development per se. Hence, this broad conceptual the category of sustainable development was very powerful in impacting and bringing about change in public policy. Sustainable development also does something else that's very important. It rejected the notion that environmental conservation necessarily contradicts development. The concept of sustainability should and could be understood within the context of development. This was very important because it brought environmental concerns into the heart of our discourse on development. I would say that the strength of the concept lies in three things. The first is that sustainable development and understanding sustainability as a concept in terms of sustainable development allowed us to talk of environmental degradation. Environmental degradation today is affecting millions around the world. Whether we're talking about the smog in Delhi, or if we're talking about water running out in Chennai, in Mumbai, or if we're talking about floods that are affecting India all over in 2019, degradation often impacts those who are poor the worst. And this discussion on environmental degradation was brought to the forefront. Another idea that was brought during sustainable development was the idea that environmental degradation often happens as a product of poverty, meaning the poor have to degrade the environment. If I am living at subsistence and I need to have more food to eat, or if I need to ensure that I earn more, I will need to go to the nearby resource in order to get a resource and sell it in the market, or use that to consume in order to live at a particular level. Hence, the poorer I get, the more I would degrade that particular resource. And this link was actually brought in. The idea then, therefore, is that environmental degradation affects a lot of people. Environmental degradation is linked to poverty. And furthermore, in the long term, environmental degradation won't just affect the poor, but it would affect everyone. For example, let's take the smog in Delhi. Air pollution in Delhi was a problem for those who lived near the industries. Today, air pollution in Delhi is a problem for parliamentarians. Everybody has to take cognizance of the fact that they can't breathe. The second strength of this particular concept is that it questioned the objective of development. Traditional objectives of development that were understood only in economic or social ways was now contextualized within the idea of the environment. Meaning, it may be profitable for you to develop without concerning the environment, or without taking the environment into consideration in the short term, but in the long term, any development process, however profitable, can only be profitable if you take into consideration the environmental impacts it has. And that's a very important thing that sustainable development brings us. The third strength of this concept comes through the idea of participation. If we're saying that the idea of sustainable development and sustainability, understood as sustainable development, takes into consideration different ideas from social, economic, political, as well as ecological, it means that people from different parts and different levels of hierarchies have to participate. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible for you to have such an over encompassing concept. Participation and local participation was a very important component of the concept of sustainable development. However, this particular concept is not without its weaknesses. And one of the main weaknesses was the strength. Remember, I said that one of the strengths of this concept is it was so broad that it was able to bring in people from different scales. That's also its weakness. Because it's so broad, it can be used by different people differently. Meaning, the term sustainable development is being used by everyone. An industry says that they have sustainable development. The government says that they're sustainable. Now, the thing is, the problem here is that mainly governments and industries are very happy to understand sustainability in terms of the idea of local participation, in terms of the idea of bringing in the relationship between poverty and environmental degradation, but they're not really interested in the critique sustainable development and the concept of sustainability has of the development process itself. Sustainability, as understood in the first topic, which has those very radical roots, basically means questioning how we develop. It means we have to bring in structural change. And if we're talking of structural change, the way we produce, the way we redistribute or distribute our resources has to be questioned. You have to ask how equitable they are. You have to ask, or drawing from the root of no growth, you have to ask how long can we grow the way we grow? Can we continue with business as usual? And these ideas are not very comfortable for either state or market. And this is a weakness of the concept. Because it's so broad, people are able to adopt it without actually taking on the radical critique of the development process itself. Another weakness is again within the strength itself. It's this interlink between poverty and degradation. Remember how I told you that if a particular person is living at subsistence level, for their livelihoods, to increase the amount of income they get, they would need to go to a particular resource and use that resource in order to supplement their livelihood. And the poorer they get, the more they would actually degrade. This seems like a very simple, easy way of understanding the relationship, right? You're poor, so you have environmental degradation, and the more the environmental degrades, the poorer you get, right? It's not so simple. For example, let me take a strand of forest and a particular village that's near it, then all the people live at subsistence. Now, they depend on this forest, say, for firewood, etc. And the more the forest degrades, the more they actually need to depend on it, because their livelihoods also become worse off because they're dependent on that forest. Now, a person who lives near the forest would probably consume a certain amount of forest, right? But think of an industry. Suppose an industry, a beer factory, this happens a lot, it's happening right now in Orissa, is set up in the forest. In terms of the number of trees they're going to cut, vis-a-vis the number of trees a person who's depending on the forest for fuel is going to cut, there is a lot of difference between the two. This relationship, therefore, is much more complex. It is basically understood or influenced by different other concepts. For example, affluence. How affluent you are will basically determine how much you actually consume. Let's take United States of America. They have about 4% of the world's population. Do you know how much of the world's resources they consume? More than 30%. And if you blame the poor for degrading the resource, then what about the people who are actually consuming it at a very, very high level? What about technology? Let's take America itself. You would say, if this relationship between population, environmental degradation works in a very easy, simple manner, the place that has the highest level of population in America would probably be the one that's actually degrading it the most, right? The place that has the highest concentration of people in one place is New York City. And New York City is one of the greenest places on earth. Why? Because they use a lot of green technology. They can afford it. Therefore, you see that the relationship between poverty and environmental degradation is much more complex. Intervening factors of affluence, cultural values, technology, access to the resource, all of this impact this relationship. And it's not as simple as the idea of sustainable development makes it to seem. Therefore, the two central arguments I'm making here are these. Sustainable development brings in the fact that there is no fundamental contradiction between the idea of growth and sustainability. There is a problem in this because there is, in the concept of sustainability, a critique of the very process of development. The second argument, in terms of the weakness, is that the basic premise of sustainable development is that poverty is largely responsible for environmental degradation. But this is not. Even a cursory understanding or research in this particular field shows that this does not really hold true. In conclusion, in this particular part, we have understood that sustainability, as understood as sustainable development, has impacted public policy, has brought to the forefront the concerns of the ecosystem and ecology. However, this concept is not without its weaknesses. To summarize the main points of this particular module, 1. There are 6 and many more, in fact, roots of the concept of sustainability. Sustainability is like a tree that draws from all these concepts, and these concepts have been developing for hundreds of years. 2. Sustainable development as we understand it today is understood in the context of development. By development, we do not mean the simplistic idea of modernity or GDP, but rather a wider idea of what is it that we want to achieve through development in terms of poverty, in terms of equity, in terms of education, in terms of longevity of life, and in terms of GDP per capita. Sustainability as a concept influenced the concept of or the discourse of development and broadened the idea of development to mean sustainable development, wherein which we brought in the context of intergenerational equity. We brought in the critique of development, and as Sharat Chandra Lele says, we brought in the idea of ecological sustainability. This concept has both its strengths and its weaknesses, but regardless, the idea of sustainability is very important as it defines public policy both today, and I see it defining public policy in future generations as well. Thank you.